Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm David, a bookseller at Literati bookstore, and we are pleased to welcome Aram Mrjoian to our At Home with Literati series in support of We Are All Armenian. He will be joined in conversation by Nancy Agabian and Mashinka Firunts Hakopian. A quick webinar overview for our attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep your chat window open as I'll be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. Q&A is accessible, so please submit questions. Live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase the book are in the description. You can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeastern Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. And most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being with us. And now, allow me to introduce tonight's panel. Aram Mrjoian is an editor-at-large of the Chicago Review of Books, an associate fiction editor at Guernica, and a 2022 Creative Armenia AGBU Fellow. He is the editor of We Are All Armenian, Voices from the Diaspora. Nancy Agabian is a writer, teacher, and literary organizer working in the spaces between race, ethnicity, cultural identity, feminism, and queer identity. Her recent work of autofiction, The Fear of Large and Small Nations, was a finalist for the PEN Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction. She's the author of Me as Her Again, True Stories of an Armenian Daughter, a memoir that was honored as a Lambda Literary Finalist for LGBT nonfiction and shortlisted for a William Saroyan International Writing Prize, and Princess Freak, a collection of poetry and performance texts. She's currently a caregiver to her elderly parents in East Walpole, Massachusetts, in the house where she grew up. Mashinka Firunts Hakopian is a writer, researcher, and artist born in Yerevan and residing in Glendale, California. She's a senior researcher at the Berggruen Institute and held a teaching appointment in UCLA's Department of English from 2017 to 2019. She holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in the history of art. She's an associate editor at Noema magazine and a contributing editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books. Her writing and reviews have appeared in Performance Research Journal, Art in America, the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. She's co-founder of the Media Performance Collective Research Service with Avi Alpert and Danny Snelson, with whom she has presented projects for the New Museum, Palais de Tokyo, La Moca, ICA Philadelphia, and elsewhere. Her book, Algorithmic Bias, Lectures for Intelligent Machines, is forthcoming from X-Artists Books. And with that, I leave you to your conversation. Enjoy, and I'll be back in a bit.
Yeah. David, thank you so much. Thanks for the great introduction. Nancy and Mashinka, thank you so much for being here with me to celebrate this book, We Are All Armenian, Voices from the Diaspora, with this beautiful cover. I really love the way it turned out. I should say this book is the result of 3 years of work. We started right in March 2020, which at the time, didn't know fully how long the pandemic would, kind of be with us and the challenges of publishing that would create. And certainly didn't know, a lot of geopolitical changes that would happen in the world at that time either. And so this project has really, it's been a long journey, but I'm so excited to be with both of you here at the other end of it and, getting to talk about it a little bit and getting to talk about not only our work, but the work of the other brilliant contributors in the collection. I know each of you are going to read for 5 minutes, and so I'm excited to hear you read some selected excerpts from your work. And Mashinka, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Aram, and thank you not only for convening us here today, but for convening us in this book. It was amazing to see this community of thinkers and artists that you've gathered together, and it's a really rare and singular thing. So I am going to read from my contribution, which is entitled Valley View, an Armenian diasporic account in lieu of a Glendale biennial review. And I just want to give a few quick prefatory comments. The text addresses an exhibition that was staged in Glendale, California, which, as many of our viewers and listeners will know, is a densely Armenian diasporic neighborhood. And the exhibition was originally titled the Glendale Biennial in 2018, but featured nary a single Armenian. The last important or salient piece of information to note is that this exhibition was happening at a time when inequitable economic development and economic violence were displacing many of Glendale's immigrant and low-income communities. So with that, I'll launch right into it. No was the only word my grandmother, Vida Khachatrian, knew in English. She declined to learn any others. The only relation she wanted to the English language was one of radical unintelligibility. After immigrating at 70, my grandmother launched a 16-year performance of linguistic refusal. It was staged for a private audience of emigre intimates. No recordings were made. We relocated from Yerevan to Glendale in 1991, like so many. By 2017, approximately 40% of the city's residents were of Armenian descent, marking it the largest diasporic population of Armenians in the West. In Glendale, it was still possible to live in Armenian dialects. On East Acacia Avenue, we gathered with neighbors to hear the Soviet Socialist Republic collapsing at the end of a long-distance telephone call we could not afford. I am telling you this because I recognize that there are no views outside of embodied viewers and historically contingent practices of looking. When I was 15, we moved to a street in the Glendale foothills from which you could see the mountains. It was called Valley View. The Pitt Gallery opened in Glendale in 2014, and 4 years later, it announced the launch of Vision Valley, the Glendale Biennial, slated for May 5th, 2018. The exhibition would be curated by the Pitt, an artist-run commercial gallery, and hosted at the Brand Library and Art Center, a publicly funded municipal space. I volunteered there as a teenager, enticed by the gleaming white architecture of the library building, originally called the Miradero, the overlook or vantage point. Among the 32 predominantly white artists selected for the Glendale Biennial, none were Armenian. The Pitt launched in Glendale amid a precipitous influx of finance capital and real estate development in the city, a period whose economic violence is obliquely hinted at in the widely used description, "This was the boom." Violence, as David Harvey puts it, is required to build the new urban world on the wreckage of the old. In 2006, the Glendale City Council adopted the Downtown Specific Plan, offering developers incentives for large-scale building projects within municipal limits. 2 years later, Caruso Affiliated opened the long-planned Americana at Brand, a $400 million luxury residential and retail complex. Its Tiffany & Co. and Tesla storefronts peered out onto impeccably manicured lawns, animated fountains, and audio kiosks, piping Frank Sinatra into a lavish open-air lifestyle center. When the Onyx Glendale Apartments finished construction in 2017, they were advertised as a testament to, quote, downtown Glendale's spectacular urban renaissance and its, quote, newly found sense of cutting-edge style, eclectic culture, and bountiful energy. The complex offers one-bedroom lofts at $3,270 per month. One effect of redevelopment was a surge of new residents who wanted, as the Onyx invites, to, quote, explore like a traveler, enjoy like a resident. Another was rendering working class and immigrant population communities a surplus population. Against the backdrop of the city's spectacular urban renaissance, the Pitt announced the Glendale Biennial in 2018. The curatorial statement for Vision Valley described the show as follows, and each of the following is a direct quote: a celebration of artists working in a specific community, a nod to Glendale's longstanding artist community, a dynamic multilogue between artists living or working in a specific geographical area that showcases the many coincidental visions at work in the valley known as Glendale. Its title presents a fairly straightforward query: whose visions of the valley do we get to see? Whose are withheld? Who decides? So the text moves back and forth between description of the gallery and the exhibition and my own autoethnographic experience. So I'll close with a short section from the latter. My mother, Sona Hakopian, was a linguist trained in Russian philology at the Academy of the Pedagogical Sciences of the USSR. In Glendale, she worked as a paralegal specializing in political asylum cases. For over 20 years, she advocated for Armenian asylum seekers who traveled along extended routes of dislocation, fleeing the Lebanese Civil War, the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the subsequent collapse of Armenia's economy, and the Syrian Civil War. Theories circulate about why the diaspora community crystallized in Glendale. My mother would say it's because the valley views approximate the mountainous topographies of Armenia. The valley, as she said, visually softens the losses of territorial dispossession. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, and our next reader, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks, Mashinka, for starting us off. And those were such great excerpts to read. And thank you, Aram, for bringing us together and holding space for all these stories. So my essay is called Inside the Walls, Reflections on Revolutionary Armenians. And I'm going to read an excerpt kind of right in the middle. The essay documents the revolution in 2018 that ousted corrupt leaders from the government of Armenia through wide-scale street actions that made enormous change possible in a little over 3 weeks. When I visited Armenia in the aftermath, I spoke to queer activists who had been actively involved with the protests. The day that I returned home to the US, a group of queer people were brutally attacked and driven out of a village called Chernuch. This disturbing, contradictory event prompted me to think about homophobia as I'd experienced it in the diaspora and the role of queer people within a larger Armenian community seeking justice. I found that a metaphor that helped me was the House Museum. And I'm going to read a passage about the particular House Museum I stumbled upon. Before the attacks in Chernuch, before the fracture, there was Zora. She was so quick to smile, and it was a pleasure to be with her, a bundle of love. Everything in Amal and Diana's apartment revolved around her. The arched windows and old double-pane glass let in a lovely light that glinted from Zora's eyes, and her coups traveled over the transom into the door of the guest room where I woke every morning. The floor plan was a central hallway with rooms opening onto rooms with swinging doors, and all paths seemed to lead to Zora, taking a nap, nursing, bathing, no matter where she was. In that revolving space, it seemed time didn't exist. From Diana and Amal's back window where we sat for breakfast, we could see the windows of Silva Gabudikyan's apartment, which had been turned into a museum after her death in 2009. I didn't know of Gabudikyan or her work, not even her famous poem in which she tells her son that he can forget her, but not his mother tongue. But one of my favorite things to do in life is visit house museums. In these spaces, time seems to exist on multiple planes, the past compressed to the present. I feel close to history, understanding it more tacitly than reading a two-dimensional text. The space is intimate and clinical at once. One afternoon after breakfast, Amal carried Zora in her arms across the parking lot and up the street and into the famous Poets Building. She and Diana had all the accessories of slings and strollers, but Zora rebelled against them, and Amal wanted to keep her safe in her arms. The four of us crowded into the tiny elevator, went up a few flights, and knocked on Silva's door. We encountered two women who gave us a tour. Silva's apartment was huge. The Soviets built it specifically for her in 1975. Her bedroom was tiny, tucked behind a narrow passageway. On her desk nearby sat a massive dictionary that had been eaten by 37 mice. I wanted to ask how they knew the precise number of rodents, but I bit my tongue since it was the only item she possessed from her father, who died when her mother was pregnant. Additionally, I was touched by her tiny bed, surrounded by heavy tapestries. Silva couldn't sleep at night during the war from 1991 to 1994. The tapestries kept out the light so that she could sleep during the day. Surprisingly, as a member of the Communist Party, Silva was also a fervent nationalist. She even met with the Armenian Secret Army for the liberation of Armenia after they blew up Turkish diplomats. I learned this when the tour guides showed us an ugly clock that Asala had gifted her. She risked her life by meeting with them. You'd think they would have sprung for a better present, but I suppose terrorists don't have much of a discretionary budget. Say what you will about Gabudikian's politics and her patriotic poetry. To be respected by both a nationalist terrorist and Soviet strongman is quite a feat, especially for a woman. On her sun porch, the one we could see from Amal and Diana's apartment, there were cases of photos and other mementos that prove Silva was loved around the world. The tour guides had known her personally. I widened my eyes when Amal translated this fact. We were standing in the kitchen, which had been repurposed as an art room for children, their paintings and drawings, inspired by Silva's poetry, covering the walls. As we approached the door and said our thank yous, one of the guides hugged me. Usually Armenians kiss both cheeks, but even showing this kind of affection seemed odd for the situation. Perhaps she wanted to bring me closer to Gabudikian's orbit. Maybe it was because I was looking at everything with great interest. When I lived in Armenia, I had trouble making sense of the harsh ways people could treat each other on the street versus the generosity they showed in their homes. Perhaps the tour guide was simply showing that famous Armenian hospitality. Perhaps her love had been compounded by the revolution. Because of economic conditions in Armenia, young people typically live with their parents until they marry. Because queer people can't marry in Armenia, they often live with their families indefinitely, and their home life can be a site of abuse. After Shernukh, it seemed to me queer Armenians couldn't be safe on the streets anymore. They had nowhere to be safe now, not in their homes and not on the streets. This is why spaces like Femme Library and Pink Armenia, they're both organizations that support queer people. This is why spaces like Femme Library and Pink Armenia are so crucial. Sadly, these organizations cannot maintain a safe space either, forced to move from place to place. I have no idea whether Silva was supportive to queer people, but I imagine she knew some in her time, operating in the world of poetry. In any case, in the timeless space of her house museum, a place both public and private at once, or neither public nor private, Diana, Amal, Zora, and I were embraced.
Thank you both for such lovely readings. I'm so grateful to have both of you here. And I told you I was going to start with this question, and so I will. So much of the collection, or the anthology, we have 18 contributors, and many of the contributions are pretty personal essays. And both of yours have elements of research and of reportage. There's kind of the personal in there, but also this very keen attention to detail about the communities that you're in or the communities that you are traveling to. And so I'm wondering about that, about kind of mixing this journalistic eye with the personal and how it influences your work.
I can go, Mashinka, if you want. Yeah, it was something that I noticed too about our pieces, and I loved how personal the anthology is. And I'm mostly a creative nonfiction writer, so I do often write personally and then find the social or political link in that personal story. And I was thinking about this subject matter and that it did feel really personal to me, even though it was about public events, because watching the revolution unfold in the wee hours of the morning and feeling like so connected and excited for it happening, and yet people around me in my immediate surroundings not having any idea, that felt very personal to me. And then when queer folks got attacked, also felt incredibly dismaying and also felt very personal. So I thank you, Aram, because the anthology gave me an opportunity to figure out why I needed to write about this, because I did have to figure out the personal story, like why am I writing? Why I knew I wanted to document it in various ways for activists, for so that queer Armenians could be visible. But I thinking about what my parallel story was as a queer caregiver, I think having the prompt to make it personal helps the story come together. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's sort of the genesis and how I think about this particular public story or reported story.
I was also struck, and I would love to talk more with both of you about the resonances between this work in terms of how we're both writing from a position of being embedded within different organizing networks. And later on in the piece and sections that I didn't read from, I write about the activity of the Glendale Tenants Union at that time, which was trying to pass a rent stabilization ordinance in order to, and many of its members were Armenian, and its co-founders. And it was a very clear moment of recognizing that Glendale's Armenian communities, among other immigrant and working class communities, were dissolving in the face of what was happening. And so I was writing from the perspective of budding involvement with that group. And also at that time that this was happening, the revolution was unfolding in Armenia. And there were constant marches. I mean, it was really one of those rare moments where you would be driving through downtown, like past the street that's now called Artsakh, and you didn't even know it was going to be happening, but there was a giant march of people just walking through with signs that say, the Diaspora stands with Armenia, and you would park your car and get out of your car and go join the march. And it was a moment of such hope and possibility and potentiality. And I really appreciate, Nancy, the ways in which your contribution surfaces the limitations and the continuing ethno-nationalism and cis heteronormativity at the heart of so much of what seemed like all that potential. But to answer the question more directly, I've always sort of worn a lot of hats disciplinarily in my work. I'm a scholar. The bio that was read was a little bit out of date. I'm actually an associate professor of technology and social justice at Art Center College here in Pasadena. And so I've always done critical work and creative work. And much of my work has been bound up with my lived experience as a diasporan. And of course, like any scholar, I've been told that sort of autoethnographic mode has no place in legitimate scholarship. And so much of my work, this piece included, is a direct rejoinder to that. And it felt very important to work in that mode for this piece in particular, because so much of what was so painful about what was happening in Glendale at the time was how it was an erasure of my lived experience, of the lived experience of so many people with whom I was working, I wrote this essay in dialogue with a collaborator and dear friend, Mildia Yasayan, who writes about having volunteered at this space where the exhibition was held, and or spoke to me about that. And so, to put a fine point on it, yeah, it felt not only important but really crucial to make lived experience the core around which these other conversations about actual events that were unfolding were happening.
Thank you both. And I guess sort of a related question, maybe not a related question, but one thing I'm curious about is, this is the first time that the three of us are talking in person since the anthology has come out. Hopefully one of many times in the future, but I know both of you, had Mashinka, in your case, having written this project for another publication originally, and Nancy, in your case, having accumulated a bunch of that research before I approached you. Even though you're both talking about 2018, these projects these essays have longevity. We're talking about them 5 years later. I'm curious, what you think about how time having passed, coming back to them now and kind of reading them now, particularly in relation to the rest of the contributions around them, and kind of seeing them in maybe a new form or a new environment.
Well, I was worried about my piece not having resonance now, because so much has changed, and who knew that so much would change even in 2 years, the war and now the blockade. And when I read the anthology, though, I was really surprised by this theme of people feeling not Armenian enough, or someone voicing an experience, like a vulnerable experience around their Armenian identity. And so I think it creates this beautiful chorus of voices in the diversity of their expression. But I also feel like the whole book tells a story, and that it starts with a lot of love. I loved that aspect of it, that the first few essays seem really centered on family, though they're complex. And then I thought my piece was kind of in a section where people are exploring ideas of homeland in various ways. And then I think it gets into really complex territory with discrimination and identity issues, where I think Mashinka's piece lands. So I feel a little better knowing that my piece is part of a larger continuum. And yeah, I also wonder, I don't know, I think I want to put this question out if anyone wants to answer it, but you don't have to. But what role of an anthology is also documentation? So, when I feel like maybe my essay got a bit too detailed in what was happening in the moment, I think, well, we can't know how things will change, and how we'll view things in the future. So I can't have so much control over this piece. So that's how I see the anthology, and I'm really excited for the conversations and impact it's going to make in the present.
Yeah, I totally echo that. And in terms of thinking about the sort of modulations to meaning that have happened over the time that I wrote it and now, that was a specific moment, and that was a specific instance of the omission of Armenian cultural communities from a space in which they should have been foregrounded. But that moment was symptomatic of a much broader tendency, right? And that tendency, as someone who, one of my sort of like disciplinary homes is the contemporary art world, I see that tendency very vividly displayed before me on a daily basis, and encounter it myself as a creative practitioner, see it as a curator, and so forth. So while that was a splice, it's a splice of long running and still very, very much alive, broader condition.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, both of you bringing this up, because this was just something that I thought about so much while I was editing, particularly, that first, like I said, kind of first proposal, March 2020, being like, well, this is what I want to do. And then you look by September 2020 and things have changed and there's a war. But somewhere in that 6 months in between, everybody had written their work, and or kind of submitted their work. And so all of a sudden I'm putting together this manuscript and going, well, like now there's new context, but, can't change the project. And Nancy, so I like what you said about documentation and thinking about how does this capture a moment in time, and not only capture a moment in time, but then that doesn't change the fact that those contributions have that longevity, have that meaning, and that they continue to resonate in new ways, as we learn more and as things change. And so it's been really exciting. I know I looked at the attendees real quick. I just snuck a peek and saw that we have a couple of the other contributors on. So that's really exciting too. And so I'm wondering, now that you've had a chance to read the whole thing, like what stood out to you, outside of your own contributions, or what kind of like what has excited you in the collection as a whole?
Nancy, please, I defer to you.
I love Sophia Arman's piece. I loved the way she unpacked the question, where are you from, and the discrimination within that in all its complexities, but also what it means for Armenians, and the way she wrote so personally, and loved how she put poems in there and italicized text that felt like a layering without explaining. That essay really surprised me, and I know her well, and she's such a powerful person. Her voice is powerful in person, and I've read some of her poetry too and have admired it, but I feel like she created something new here, and yeah, that was one of my faves.
It's hard to choose just one. And okay, I will say they were all spectacular, but the ones that have been resonating for me recently are Hadag Vartanyan's really striking and intense and poignantly rendered account of what it was like to be subjected to surveillance as a Syrian Armenian in Canada and in the US. And the entire text is centered around this question: where do stories in the body live? And how do those stories live themselves out in these embodied moments of trauma? That and Karani's incredible text that was originally published in the LAist, I believe, on being a Black Armenian Angelino, and what that, and thinking about Artsakh from that specific vantage point, I think brings such a crucial set of topics to this conversation that I hope will really reshape how we have conversations around what it means to be Armenian diasporans.
And I realized that I said we have other contributors on, but then give them a shout out. So JP and Alina, hi, it's good to see you. on here. And I guess talking about that or thinking about that last essay in the collection, and some of the themes that are carrying over towards more contemporary issues, which was one of the things that was important to me in putting this together. Is I was kind of thinking about like, well, what are the Armenian writers I'm really excited about writing about, and then in what ways is that being potentially limited by commercial or editorial demands, and how can we take away some of those limitations and like have a different type of conversation. And so I'm curious, I guess, like, because it seems like there are, I don't know, hopefully, like I hope so, like more books like this kind of coming out, or that more people are starting to kind of find a way to challenge maybe commercial narrative patterns. And so I'd be really interested in kind of hearing like what you think, like what kind of literature you're excited about that maybe this book is in conversation with, or other things, other writers right now that are working that maybe we can look for in the future and be excited about their work in the future.
Nancy, please, you go ahead.
One of the, I don't, like, I guess I was thinking about this anthology that, to echo what you said, Aram, there could be so many more, even in the Armenian community. I think I was in another anthology called Forgotten Bread that was published in 2007, which was, you can kind of see, it'd be really interesting to compare how the conversation has changed since then, where there did seem to be this effort at preservation, because it was like first generation and genocide survivor authors being introduced by first and second generation authors. So I do think it's exciting to think about what like a multi-genre Armenian anthology might look like. Or I thought Rafi Vartanyan's essay, The Letter from His Great-Grandfather, was such an interesting experiment. And I think each of the essays, I think, took some kind of experimental stance. And I thought in your intro making the point about the decisions we make to explain or not explain was really interesting. And I guess I'm curious how other communities deal with that question about explaining and not explaining. So I didn't think of like a specific author or a specific trend in writing, but that's kind of what I was imagining, how it feels like we're in a time of a lot of Armenian publishing, actually, that there's like a lot of activism and organizing through publishing. And so I think this is a great contribution to what's like a very, even though we're going through very traumatic times in our community, it's a very hopeful expression.
Yeah, I would, I suppose, point not to specific anthologies, but instead to work that's being done by networks like YALA, like the International Armenian Literary Alliance, that was co-founded by Olivia Katranjan, and is doing some remarkable work, including offering mentorship opportunities to young writers and holding young poet awards contests and offering grants for translation into Western Armenian and from Western Armenian. And then also spaces like Azad Archives, which is an online publication co-founded and co-edited by Araxi Cass that really is surfacing dimensions of like diasporic and conversations in the diaspora and in the homeland that have been submerged in prevailing versions of what it means to be Armenian for a very long time.
Thank you both. Nancy, it's so funny that you mentioned Rafi Vartanian's essay because I remember, it's a letter from his great-grandfather. It's just like such an experimental form. And I remember when I first started talking to him, he goes, "Hey, I have an idea for this essay. Like, can I give you a phone call?" And I said, "Sure." And I was living in Florida at the time. And I was like, "I'm going to be at the beach today, but give me a call and hopefully the wind's not too loud and we can talk." And so we get on the phone and I'm like walking up and down the beach with the wind. And he's going, "So the idea is I'm going to write a letter to myself from my great-grandfather. And, that's, and it'll be creative nonfiction. So everything will be true, but I'm kind of like filling in some gaps and, doing this thing with voice." And I was just sitting there going like, I don't know if an academic press is ever going to go for this, but like, let's see what we can do and let's try it. And I think it turned out, like in its experimentation to be one of the most interesting and kind of unique parts of the collection because it's doing something so different with form and because it's really pushing against the boundaries of genre. And so it was just like, it was really remarkable kind of seeing that come into fruition. I know that we're like right at 1 minute before I know David was going to jump back in with audience questions. And so I want to make sure that we don't like completely ram up against that. But
Yeah, I don't currently have any questions. So all you 13 attendees out there, if you have any burning questions, submit them now and I will gladly relay the message. You guys can just keep being in conversation though. I will monitor that and I will pop back in if there's a burning question.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. And so Mashinka, I had a question for you because you have, and I have it with me, you have this book coming out. And I read it right before I flew out to Seattle last week. And it is, talking about experimental, like I think, you are doing a lot of really interesting things with genre, with form, and also with technology. And so I'm kind of curious, if you would talk a little bit about, because this book is coming out soon, kind of what you're currently working on, and how you see this book kind of tying into either like similar or different from what you were writing for this collection.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you for reading the book. I'm delighted. So there's a section in the essay that I published in We Are All Armenian that talks about how the gallery that organized this exhibition justifies the exclusion of Armenians. And the way that they justify it is by saying repeatedly, we were looking for contemporary artists. We wanted artists who are working in the contemporary mode. It's this paragraph, it's a pretty dense paragraph, and the word contemporary appears 4 or 5 times in it. And there's a very clear implication that there is a tense of production that Armenians are not part of, that Armenians do not belong to the temporality of the present, or by extension, the future, they belong to the past. And that was something that that series of exchanges has precipitated a lot of the work that I've been doing around futures and futurity. And so in this more recent book, which is written from the perspective of future AI agents in this sort of speculative fiction mode, but still grounded very much in contemporary media studies and contemporary media theory and reporting. I think about who gets to write the future, how technologies participate in encoding the future, and who's left out of that. And of course, it opens with an old Soviet anecdote that my mother used to tell me about a supercomputer that bursts into flames when it receives an Armenian greeting, Inchkachka, which means what is there and what isn't there, because it misinterprets this greeting as a call to surface every data point it knows. But what does that tell us? It tells us that this particular computer, which was programmed as an aid to future generations, imagined or operates in an imaginary of the future that excludes Armenian vernacular speech. So those are some of the ways in which that work has led into some of this more recent work.
So we do have a question. Someone would like to know, for all three of you, what new projects are inspiring you right now?
Great question, I guess. New projects, as in stuff we're working on?
That's the question. So, I'm going to go with like Proust questionnaire inside the actor's studio. Interpret it as you'd like.
Well, I don't know. I feel like I'm inspired all the time just by what other people are doing. And so like reading Mashinka's book, for example, was really exciting for me because truthfully, like I don't know that much about AI. And so like being able to read about it and learn about some of the problems with it and contemporary issues around it was really exciting for me and like artistically motivating. And I guess in my own work, to kind of answer both sides of the question, I'm working on a novel that is really early and been exciting. I've been really trying to think about, I'm always excited about kind of a multiplicity of subject matter. And lately I've been thinking a lot about climate crisis. And so I've been writing climate fiction because that's what's interesting to me. And trying to be funny while doing it, although sometimes it's hard to kind of laugh when you're staring down environmental collapse. But I guess that's been most of my stuff right now.
Mashinka, do you want to go?
No, please, you go ahead. I spoke for ages just a minute ago.
I'm reading a translation of Shushan Avakian's book. It's called A Book Untitled, that Diana Kachoyan-Shans recently translated. And I love it. It's she blends a personal narrative with ideas about translation and thinking about Armenian feminist poets from the 19th century being in conversation with each other. So it's just a really cool collage to step into and to feel like I'm in a conversation with the writer as I read it. And I don't know if I should plug my own novel now.
You have to. I was just coming in to say plug your novel.
I am excited. I announced the pre-orders, I guess it was 2 days ago. So it's a novel about an abusive relationship. The writer is trying to extricate herself from an abusive relationship as a second-generation Armenian bisexual feminist Armenian American woman in relationship with a man from Armenia. And it's pre-revolution. It takes place between 2005 and 2011, when people kept saying it was going to take 2 generations for corruption to end in Armenia, and it felt impossible to make societal change, and this character feels stuck in a relationship that she feels like she can't change, and in trying to figure out why she's so stuck, she thinks a lot about the kind of myths and stories that get passed between the homeland and the diaspora about family and gender roles and relationships and shame. So I'm excited. It's been a very long journey, so I'm excited to get it out there. And I'm excited to read Mashinka's book.
Thank you, Nancy, and vice versa, likewise.
I have another question here. Who gets to be Armenian is an ongoing question in the community, and so many in the diaspora worry about being Armenian enough. Can the speakers talk about that title and how it is an unapologetic statement? We are all Armenian.
Well, I guess this one kind of should fall in
I
there
was
a little
gonna
bit.
say, yes, tell us.
And so the title comes from one of the essays in the collection by Scout Tufengchen, and is really kind of, thinking about the fact that that idea of not being Armenian enough, like someone getting to decide whether or not you have access to your identity, to your ethnicity, is really an act of violence. Like, the reality is that regardless of, your gender or race or anything like that, if you are part Armenian, like, you should be welcomed into the community. And so a big part of putting together this project, a big part of opening up conversations around this project is opening up conversations about intersectionality and inclusivity, and really thinking about ways that certain voices have been silenced inside and outside of Armenian communities. And, like you said, it's kind of an unapologetic statement. Like, if we're going to have this conversation, let's have it, and let's welcome people in and be able to think about that complexity and think about some of the reasons for this historic marginalization and how we can progressively make a more inclusive future.
And then final question. This viewer says that they know you addressed it a little bit in conversation, but curious to know how you all wrestled with the war breaking out over the course of writing these pieces, and if you felt you had to alter your writing in order to address it, or if you didn't feel like it.
I guess I can answer this really briefly. For me, I kind of had to think about it as I had to start thinking about the anthology as an artifact almost the moment that it came together. And then, like we talked about earlier, is that understanding that we can't address everything. And doing a couple things to update it in ways that we could. I updated my introduction a year after writing the original one. We were able to include some late contributions, particularly about ArtSoc. And so we did the work of trying to make it as current as possible. But, particularly in publishing, a very slow industry, eventually you run up against a wall. And so I think, again, celebrating the contributions as something that can both be a kind of timestamp and something that are in conversation with the future.
I like that. Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Aram, Nancy, Mashinka, thank you for being with us at Home with Literati tonight. And thank you to our viewers as well. Make sure you buy the book as well as the other books we've mentioned, pre-order campaigns. The link is in the chat for this book and the event listing that brought you here. And of course, you can always come into our store where we have plenty more recommendations where that came from. Thank you for your support, and we will see you at the next event.
Thank you so much, David. Nancy, Michelle.